Listen, it's been almost a year. Well, it has been a year, hasn't it? Yeah. Well, this time a year ago, we knew what the election result was. I don't know if we knew the official results, but we all didn't know what the composition of the government was going to be, and we certainly didn't know what the coalition agreements would be. So we were in an interesting state this time a year ago, and that was only a year ago. So much has happened in that time. There are some themes that have run over the last year. But I read a particularly interesting article on the last year. I actually got him on to talk about the Reserve Bank, but he's written another article that he will be happy to talk about. Dr. Oliver Hartwich joins us now from the Business or the New Zealand Initiative. And welcome to the show, Oliver. I've just read your article it was published last week, but there's so much in it that is worth unpacking. Talking about a year in government under the new Prime Minister, Christopher Luxon, and your essential thesis is that he actually runs New Zealand pretty much like he ran Air New Zealand, and that is he's a corporate leader, almost not a politician. Is that your assessment?
Pretty much so. But anyway, first of all, good morning, Michael. Great to be with you. Yeah, the piece I wrote was a reflection on Luxon's leadership style. And what triggered it was that we got the quarterly plan for the final quarter of the year just about a week ago with another, I don't know how many dozen action points and things that the government wants to tick off over that period. And this follows, of course, from previous quarterly plans and, of course, from the government's initial 100-day plan. And I thought, well, it would be worth reflecting on that because, okay, we know that governments around the world typically have 100-day plans, and they like to be judged on kind of ticking all the boxes from the 100-day plans. But to actually continue this practice and put quarterly plans in place, that is something I haven't really come across yet. I know that John Key liked to use KPIs, so key performance indicators, for his cabinet ministers. So that's not entirely new. I know there were other government leaders, prime ministers, presidents in history who like to take a bit more of a corporate approach. And I mentioned Jimmy Carter, I mentioned Tony Blair and that. But what Luxon's doing here seems to be something a little bit different. So the pace actually of change is something that I find quite impressive, and actually I would welcome that, because if you look back over the past year, and you mentioned, I mean, the election was last year, we only got the government towards I think mid or end November because the coalition negotiations took a while. But when you look at actually what have they done, what have they achieved, what have they ticked off, that's quite impressive actually. So basically in the first 100 days, they got rid of a lot of the things that, nobody really liked from the previous administration. So they got rid of the new Resource Management Act, the Natural and Built Environment Act, and restated the IMA. They started the IMA reform process. They started massive education reforms. Simeon Brown took off on actually getting towards road pricing, road user charging. There is so much happening. And now actually the latest was over the weekend when Winston Peters and David Seaver both talked about foreign direct investment, which, by the way, was well signaled in advance. It's part of the coalition agreement, but it's happening now too. So my point really in the column was just to reflect on the speed and what kind of leadership this is we're getting from this government and, of course, from the Prime Minister.
Yes, and it's interesting how that's going down. I think you're right about this pace that's undergone, and it's not something that we've seen before. We probably have to go back, in actual fact, to the 80s and 90s to say, listen, we've been elected with a policy and a program, we've thought this out and getting enacted, because as a general rule, the people who slow you down are the public sector in Wellington, who've got, I won't say necessarily their own agenda, but certainly their own view of the world. What has made the public sector fall in between? I mean, we got the leaks, they were inevitable from people who are upset. Is it also the threat that they might lose their job?
Yeah, maybe just a comment on the leaks. I mean, you say they were inevitable, and probably in today's climate they are, but they shouldn't be, and we shouldn't accept that. I mean, the public service is there to serve. It's in the name. And unfortunately, we have a public service that has become quite politicized. Not necessarily in a party political sense, but actually in an ideological sense. So the public service obviously doesn't like some of the reforms being implemented, and so they've decided no longer to serve, or at least not the government of the day, and so they're leaking. But I think there's nothing acceptable about that. We should actually go back to a public service model as it used to be maybe 20, 30 years ago, where the public service just implemented what the politically elected government of the day wanted, because it is only the politically elected government that can claim any kind of democratic mandate. But anyway,
but that's
you're
easy
right.
to do in actual fact, Oliver. All you have to do is keep on firing the chief executives of the departments, whether they're health, education. Yeah.
That is easier said than done, because we make it practically impossible for the Prime Minister to fire any public service leaders, unlike Australia, for example. In Australia, I think we talked about this before, Michael. In Australia, the new incoming Prime Minister can shift heads of government departments around, fire them, and Albanese did that. In New Zealand, of course, in between all of this, we've got the Public Service Commission, and that makes it really hard for an incoming government to really assert themselves and say, no, we want to do things differently. And therefore, the ability of the new government, of the new Prime Minister, to actually implement the agenda with the public service is a bit limited.
Yeah. Listen, maybe the reform of the State Sack Directors is something that is next on the agenda. You've also pointed out, though, with Luxon in particular, that, as you say, he makes a list and then he measures progress against that list. I guess that's fairly easy to do in your first year when you've got a pretty clear manifesto, detailed, and a relatively manifestoed coalition agreements with your partners as well. But that exercise, Oliver, must run out, mustn't it? You must run out of puff because you run out of things to do.
Yeah, and that was one of the problems that I mentioned in the piece. The other thing that might derail the government is, of course, events. Harold Macmillan once said, events, dear boy, events, about the things that can actually derail a government. And that's true. So if we get a proper crisis, say another big earthquake or a tsunami or a global financial crisis or another pandemic, heaven forbid, that's when you actually see whether this management style that Luxon has will even work under these circumstances. So there are a few dangers really to that style of government. A, as you say, you might run out of things to do, hopefully not too soon, because I think there's a lot more that needs to be reformed in New Zealand. But then B, certainly the kind of events that might derail the government and actually take them off their agenda. The third risk is, of course, and that brings us back to the public service or the courts or maybe the media actually torpedoing some of the reforms and trying to derail them in that kind of way. But anyway, for the time being, after the first, nearly a year, I would give the government a bit of a tick of approval for that approach, because it has been a relatively short time, and yet they managed to introduce quite a few new policies, quite in bulk, really. And especially given our constraint, which is a 3-year electoral cycle, which I think is ridiculous, that is actually not too bad, because we know that realistically they can only really get stuff done in the first maybe 1.5, 2 years, and then we're straight going into the next election campaign. So this is the window now for them to actually get stuff done, and so far I think they're doing it.
Just carrying on with that technocratic theme, it was really interesting. You drew a comparison with Lee Kuan Yew. Now, for some of our younger listeners, Lee Kuan Yew was the Prime Minister of Singapore, is widely credited with making that country the powerhouse that it is, or at least starting that. He's dead now, of course. He was a contemporary of Sir Robert David Muldoon, who used to admire him greatly and obviously wished he could do the same. Lee Kuan Yew is a bit more technocratic. Yes, it was a technocrat, but he also was a lot more powerful in a system that was quite prepared to accept the radical changes he was imposing upon them. You've drawn that comparison with them. In which way do you see Luxon and Lee Kuan Yew inhabiting the same space?
Well, the main reason why I actually made that comparison was because a couple of weeks ago I was in Singapore myself. And it just reminded me, because I was in Singapore for meetings with policy folk, just trying to get an idea on how they function, how they work, how they operate. And it was mightily impressive talking to people in Singapore, because the contrast couldn't have been bigger. So there was a public service that actually operated pretty much like a corporate. They were actually driving corporates. I can tell you an example. We had a lunch meeting with a corporate affairs person, a government relations person, who used to work in New Zealand and is now in the same position in Singapore. And he mentioned to us that actually when he worked here, he regularly had to push government towards technical innovation, IT innovation, AI, that kind of stuff, and found it really hard because he was actually not finding too much a receptive environment there. Now he works in Singapore in exactly the same role, and he says it's the opposite. It's actually the government calling him now, saying, hey, we've got a great idea of a technical solution. Can you, as a big multinational, do that for us? And then he says, yeah, my response is, yeah, absolutely, we're looking into that. And a couple of days after that initial phone call, it's the government phoning the company back saying, and what have you done? Following up. I mean, in New Zealand, it would be unthinkable. So it shows you the completely different mindset. Actually, in the couple of days I spent in Singapore, I probably heard the term AI, artificial intelligence, more often used than probably in a whole year in New Zealand. And it is just absolutely impressive. So practical things. I mean, when I arrived in Singapore, of course, they take your biometrics and they scan you when you put your passport in at immigration. On the way out, I had my passport in my hand walking towards the gate, and the gate recognized me and opened without me even putting the passport on. So this was quite futuristic, and it was typical, really, of the whole experience of Singapore. And so when I wrote about Luxon, and Luxon being more of that kind of style of leader, that was a bit more of a hopeful reflection on what I just experienced in Singapore, because Luxon actually, in many ways, runs it as if this was some kind of Singapore. And actually, I've talked to Luxon about this previously, and I heard him speak glowingly about Singapore. He's a great fan of that model. And, you know, he's only been a politician for 4 years, really. So he became prime minister after just one term, and he's now completed his first year as prime minister. Deep down, I think, he still hasn't made that complete transformation to a politician just yet. And that's a good thing. Because actually, I don't want another politician. I actually want someone who really gets stuff done. And if it requires 100-day plans and quarterly action plans and KPIs, and just speeding up the process of reform, that can only be a good thing. So if he makes us a bit more like Singapore, all the power to him.
There is quite a bit of expectation that reform was going to be part of the agenda of this incoming government. There is an impatience from two activist minor coalition partners, both the ACT Party and New Zealand First, that things progress as quickly as possible and at a bit more fundamental. There is a perception, and I'm interested in testing you on this one, Oliver, there's a perception that Chris Luxon is too centrist, too middle of the road, not so much too technocratic, but he doesn't necessarily have the same vision that Winston Peters or David Seymour's credited with. You wouldn't agree with that?
What I would say is actually that I think he probably is not an ideologue. He is probably not someone with a deep underlying philosophy where you could wake him up in the middle of the night, ask him any question, and would get an instinctive answer. He's not a David Seymour in that sense. I mean, David Seymour is a committed libertarian who's worked in libertarian think tanks and has read his Hayek and has written his essays for Hayek essay competitions. I know that. He even won that competition. And so in that sense, David comes from a philosophy where he's quite committed and he knows exactly what he wants. Luxon, meanwhile, comes from a completely different background as a business leader. And if you're in business, I mean, an ideology probably doesn't help you. And so I'm not sure whether he has much of that. It's more pragmatist approach to seeing what can I do, what can we get done. And so from the outside, that might look like he doesn't know where he wants to go because he's not talking about his Hayek and Friedman and Mises all the time, as David Seymour probably would. But he takes it from this pragmatic perspective. Now, you have to ideally marry the two. So in a way, we're lucky to have Luxon together with David Seymour because in an ideal world, they would actually complement each other. So where Seymour would bring in a bit more of a philosophical ground in, where Luxon would bring in his corporate kind of, okay, and this is how we're going to get it done stuff. If you bring the two together, if you actually let them work together, this could actually be a good combination. So we can hope that this will get us there. What Luxon does bring, though, is a lot of international experience. So he, of course, worked in America, in Canada. He traveled a lot in Asia as well as part of that previous job. And of course, he's got loads of international connections from his time at Air New Zealand. So he's actually seen international best practice. He knows how other countries get stuff done. And so we're bringing in that practical perspective of knowing that, for example, in Ireland, there is an investment agency, IDA, that actually helps foreign investors set root in Ireland and actually start their business there. Or his knowledge of Singapore, how that works, I think can only be helpful because we need both. We need the theoretical foundation, and we need the practical knowledge and the practical experience of how to actually get this on the road.
You've been talking about the opposition, the media as well, the news media, the mainstream news media. It's certainly been prominent in the first 12 months that not just the public sector, as you say, taking a particular political view and sometimes deliberately wedging themselves in between the National Party, if you like, and the policy they want to enact. I've just seen breaking news now that there's a One News Varian poll tonight which shows that 30% believe the country is in better shape than a year ago, but 40% think it's in worse shape and 26% see no difference. And that Prime Minister Christopher Luxon and National Party face challenges with a drop in support noted. Is that as a consequence, do you think, of a year of negative media, or is the environment, the economic environment and the financial environment in which ordinary folk are living, a reflection or being concerned that the National Party aren't actually achieving, despite all those bullet points and their quarterly targets, aren't actually achieving anything that is materially assisting New Zealanders in their daily lives?
I think it's neither. I think what we actually see is the reality, because life is tough in New Zealand. We are going through a massive economic crisis. We are slowly emerging from it. It was a crisis characterized by massive amounts of inflation. That's now gradually coming back down to where it should be. We had a massive correction in our GDP per capita. I mean, we probably don't talk enough about it, because actually the headline figure is still kind of around zero for GDP growth. But actually, if you break this down per capita, because we had massive amounts of inward migration, we are currently around 6% below levels that we had before COVID. So actually, on a per capita basis, this has been a severe recession, and probably a worse one compared to the GFC, for example, from 2008-9. So when people say that they feel worse off, they are correct, because we've just gone through a horrible economic time. Nothing, of course, nothing from that experience has anything to do with the new government, because we're talking about developments that have massive time lags. So what people are feeling these days is really the responsibility of the previous government, because it was their policies, it was the Reserve Bank's policies that got us into the mess. What the new government is doing is they're cleaning it up, and they have done a really good cleanup job of it, except all of this will take a few months and sometimes years to materialize and yield results. So problem actually with...
They've only got 2 more before there's the next election, Oliver, as you've just pointed out.
Well, yeah, and I think in a couple of years' time, we will have a completely different situation, because we now had another OCR cut last week. There will be more to come. So people will feel this in their pockets when they don't have to pay that much on their mortgage payments again. And people will also see that the jobs market will become a little bit easier to navigate if you're looking for a new job. People will also see that their incomes are going up, because we're recovering from the period we've been through. And by 2026, I think will be in that part of the cycle that makes it easier for the government to claim success.
Okay.
But right
Oliver,
now,
listen, I've got to go, my friend. I've got to hit the 11 o'clock news. I thank you for your time this morning. Much appreciated. We'll talk again. Have a very good week, and we'll catch up with you soon.
Absolutely. Take care.
You too. Okay. Oliver Hartwich, New Zealand Initiative.